Welcome back to episode 2 of the Goblincast. In today's show, we are going to be focusing a lot on the North. We'll start the episode with discussing who is the hooded man that we see in A Dance with Dragons in Theon's POV. And the second segment will focus on what is going on with Alliser Thorne. Is he alive? Is he dead? What will his possible role be in the story? Will he come back as an other? What will happen with the character? And the final segment will be focused on the character of Nettles. Why did House of the Dragon exclude this awesome character from the television show? And going through who the actual character of Nettles is if you've never heard of the character. So I hope you guys all enjoy the show, and if you do enjoy it, please consider liking and subscribing. And this character's been very mysterious. We see Theon seeing this character in literally like a paragraph or two in A Dance with Dragons, and this person maybe is allegedly killing some of the people in Winterfell and helping create a lot of the issues going on at Roose Bolton's camp in Winterfell. Because as we see with A Dance with Dragons, the main conflict in the North seems to be between Stannis and the Boltons. Now, the Boltons have a couple of northern houses that are backing them, but we have a lot of reasons to believe that those northern houses are not really working in the Boltons' best interests, and even more so with the Freys because of the Red Wedding. So when we see this character of the Hooded Man pop up with Theon when he's at Winterfell, there's been a lot of speculation brought up about the character because it's a very odd confrontation. It isn't something that lasts very long, but the description of the Hooded Man and the conversation that happens are very odd, and we've never gotten confirmation onto the Hooded Man. So let's talk a little bit about the known deaths that are happening in Winterfell, who those might be from, and the relation that that has to the Hooded Man, because in the Hooded Man section, Theon believes that this could have been the person that is doing all these different murders. So the known deaths that we have in A Dance with Dragons in Winterfell are Roger Ryswell's groom, Aenys Frey's squire, a Flint man, Yellow Dick, a companion of Ramsay, and Little Walder Frey. So all of these are interesting because none of them really happened to the quote-unquote like Stark loyalists, for instance. So when we look at the Stark loyalists, we think of House Manderly, House Umber, maybe even House Dustin, but this happens to the Frey camp, to the Ryswell camp, to the Flint man, which that one we're not even sure was actually even a murder. It very easily could have just been an accident, given it's like a horse kicks the Flint man. It doesn't really seem like that one was a murder, but it could be. Yellow Dick, who is definitely a Bolton guy, especially closer to Ramsay, and then Little Walder Frey, well, is another Frey, but I also think that that doesn't really have relation to the Hooded Man. So likely it's known that probably the Spearwives were involved with killing most of these people, especially Roger Ryswell's groom, Aenys is Frey's squire, and Yellow Dick, just given the fact that when Theon kind of comes to this conclusion himself, that they have been the ones killing some of these people in Winterfell, they don't even really shy away from it. And if you also think about the manner in which some of these men were killed, a lot of the times it's with these men either not having clothes on, or in Yellow Dick's, his manhood was stuffed into his mouth, and it was done so crudely that like his teeth are broken because of it. And so these men died in a way that seems like these women, the Spearwives, got them into a compromising position, maybe offering sex, and then killed them. That makes sense for, I think, at least 3 of these. Like I said, I think the Flint man was probably just an accident that was kind of also lumped into these mysterious deaths and murders. And then Little Walder Frey seems way more likely that it was Big Walder, just based upon the fact that Big Walder is always talking about trying to get further up in the Frey line. And even think about some of the earliest moments we have with Big Walder and Little Walder. It's on the news that Stevron Frey dies, and both of them don't even care. It's also to justify Jojen's dreams and what he tells Bran and his like prophecies, more or less. And so you also look at the character of Big Walder. You know, he has these bloody hands in relation to Little Walder's death, seems to indicate guilt. So when you think about all of these known deaths, none of them, in my opinion, seem to indicate that it was a Hooded Man. Now, the Hooded Man could be helping the Spearwives, could be involved in a northern conspiracy, whether that's with a character like Wyman Mannerly, who's, plotting to get Rickon back and putting him and establishing him as the Lord of Winterfell. Or it could be with a character like Moore's Crowfoot Umber, who arrives at Winterfell, and there's a lot of interesting maybe connections we have with him and this Spearwife group. And you also just have a lot of different factions working for maybe trying to get Stannis to win. And you think about what the outcome is. The Freys get sent out into going against Stannis in a land they don't know that well, with the Manderleys as well, and that seems to be what Stannis is wanting. Stannis is not worried at all about being attacked. It almost seems like he's baiting them in to attack him specifically, and so it seems like these deaths are very calculated. They're to put that distrust and to grow the tensions within the castle. And we know that plan works basically flawlessly, as you have the Freys, the Manderleys' throats, and it's such a desperate situation that Roose is kind of fearful. Even Theon picks up on that Roose seems to have some sort of doubt, and at this he sends out basically the Frey and Manderley armies. So in terms of the actual deaths, I don't think any of them really are just the hooded man specifically killed these people. But let's look at the actual interaction and try to figure out some of the clues for who the hooded man could be. So the hooded man finds Theon in the chapter The Ghost of Winterfell in reference to, well, Theon. But you also think about the way that this hooded man arrives. He kind of seems like this very ghostly figure in terms of he's hooded and he has a dagger, and the way he approaches Theon when it's basically in the middle of like a blizzard and there's snow coming down and it's super high. The hooded man strides towards Theon almost with this confidence. And as the two meet, the hooded man almost instantly recognizes Theon, calling him a kinslayer, and that he is false, and wondering how Theon is even alive. And so the kinslayer thing doesn't make a lot of sense right away, because on one hand, Theon is a Greyjoy. He was never Brandon and Rickon's brother or anything like that, so him being a kinslayer doesn't make sense if you believe he killed Brandon and Rickon, if you don't. The only way that could make sense is if you are someone that was at Winterfell and maybe saw Theon grow up with Bran and Rickon. And so Theon would have been considered like their brother. So for instance, when Catelyn hears the news of what happens to Bran and Rickon, she thinks about how Theon had eaten at her table and all this stuff since he was a young boy. And so you could make that idea. So it already paints the idea that the person that is the hooded man has to have a personal knowledge of Theon to some degree. And that's really something that's important. But something else I want to raise with this is the idea that when Theon is instantly recognized, it's very odd, because if you're somebody that didn't know Theon was still alive and what had been done to him, how would you instantly recognize Theon? Because Theon is visibly aged. I mean, his hair has basically gone like he's an old man, like it's white at this point. He doesn't look anything like Theon used to. Remember the way we come into the character of Theon in A Dance with Dragons, it's completely unfamiliar. Even the people coming to get Theon don't even recognize him. He's completely changed overall. And so if you're somebody that was, say, a guard, or you were somebody at Winterfell before Theon did all of this stuff, and now you come back to him, and remember, it's also not the best conditions. Like, Theon couldn't see that far in front of him because of the snow and the blizzards and all that. How would you instantly recognize that this was Theon if you already thought that he was dead? Because the hooded man asked Theon, how are you still alive? And so Theon says, the gods are not done with me. He shows him his maimed hand, all that kind of stuff. But that's a huge detractor I have in this theory, is that when you look at any character now about who could this possibly be, you have to remember they instantly pick up on who Theon is before Theon even really speaks, but they also didn't realize that Theon was alive at the same time. That to me is very suspicious. So let's then look at the idea of who calls Theon a kinslayer, because this is usually where the theory goes. Theon is only called a kinslayer by really two other people. One of Mance's spearwives, being Rowan, and also Crowfood Umber. Now this is very relevant given the fact that Crowfood Umber has a lot of coincidences that happen in A Dance with Dragons. Because when we see the hooded man, it is pretty much the exact same time that Moore's Crowfood Umber arrives outside of Winterfell's walls. That is very interesting, because that either would imply that as Crowfood Umber arrives, that also seems to indicate when the hooded man comes. Because if you're the hooded man and you've been in Winterfell for a long time, how would you not know that Theon is alive? Like, it's not like Theon is necessarily hidden, and he's walking Winterfell like every night. Like, how would you not know that to be the case? You'd be a terrible spy if you didn't know that. And so that is a really big part of this, is that we have to look at the character of Rowan and also Crowfoot Umber, because could Crowfoot Umber be involved in this whole plot that Mance has going on in terms of trying to get Arya to be freed, or the fake Arya, I should say, and trying to sow chaos within Roose Bolton's ranks? Because that all could be very important. They both have connections to Stannis, with Mors being part of Stannis' army, and also Rowan being sent by Melisandre with possibly an alternative motive that Jon doesn't know. Jon was sending them to try and save Arya, or who he believes is Arya, but there also is something else there. Melisandre has her tricks. And so you might be asking, why do I keep making some sort of connection between Rowan and Mors Umber? It's just the idea that Mors had a daughter and she was taken by the wildlings. And when you look at the character of Rowan, she has this weird respect for the Starks. Why would a wildling spearwife have a lot of respect for the Starks when she's a wildling? They're completely opposite ends of the spectrum. They hate each other for the most part, at least the wildlings should. And so that doesn't make a lot of sense. And then also her deep hatred for Theon, it's just really weird. It doesn't make a lot of sense unless Rowan had some sort of background of being, a Northman. And it would make sense if she was brought up by the Umbers and then she gets taken, that she would already have that background. And then that would have a connection there with her then to Crowfoot Umber. But then it also even makes more sense because when Theon and Jane, or fake Arya, actually escape, conveniently Mors is the one that's able to capture them almost immediately. If that had not happened, they might have been taken prisoner once again by Ramsay, and who knows what would have been done. But I do want to dissuade the idea that this hooded man actually was Crowfoot Umber, because, well, Mors doesn't have an eye, and Theon looks directly at this hooded person, and they have both of their eyes. So unless this is a glamour by Melisandre or something along those lines, which we're not really given any indication that that's the case, this doesn't seem to be the person from who it is. Now, could it be somebody that is working on Mors Umber's orders? Totally could be, trying to help the Spearwives, all that kind of stuff. There's definitely, I think, enough evidence to possibly suggest that that could be the case. But then let's look at a couple people that could possibly be the hooded man. And again, I want to point to the idea that this person seems to, if it's not, which we'll talk about, Theon's imagination or his split personality or something, it has to be somebody that seems to be familiar with Winterfell and would be familiar with Theon himself to call him a kinslayer, just based upon the idea that he views Theon, Bran, and Rickon as being like siblings. So the first proposed person that people have said it could be is Robert Glover. This is the same Robert Glover that appears in Davos's last chapter in A Dance with Dragons, who is working with Wyman Manderly of trying to bring the Stark restoration. Now, the biggest issue right away here is that Robert Glover wouldn't be calling Theon a kinslayer, because Robert Glover, based on the last chapter, knows that Rickon and Bran at least escaped or are alive. So it doesn't make a lot of sense for Robert Glover to then call Theon a kinslayer and all this kind of stuff. That doesn't really check out. And so Robert Glover has the motivation to try and be doing all this sabotage and maybe working with the Stark loyalists, but it doesn't fit the actual character. And Robert Glover as well wouldn't be super familiar with Winterfell either, you would assume, and also wouldn't be super familiar with Theon to where he would instantly recognize him either. So I don't really think that this is the case, but I know people have brought it up, so I did want to point to it as well. Moving on, we have the idea that it could be Harwin. Now, this is the same Harwin we see in A Storm of Swords with Arya, and Harwin was one of Ned Stark's soldiers that he brings south, and he ends up in the party sent with Beric to go deal with the Mountain. That ends up going horribly awry, and Harwin finds himself with the Brotherhood without banners. So the idea for Harwin is, we know Lady Stoneheart is searching for Arya, and Harwin has a closer relationship with Arya, given that you have that heartfelt meeting between the two in A Storm of Swords, and now you have the motivation with Lady Stoneheart being at the head of the Brotherhood without banners to go and look for Arya. And given the news is that Arya is being sent to the north and that she is being married to Ramsay. The big issue I have with this one is there's no indication that Harwin has left the Brotherhood. We don't see any reference to that in Brienne's chapter in A Feast for Crow, her last one. And we also have to assume that, again, remember, the Brotherhood know the last whereabouts of Arya. That Arya was probably with the Hound, all that kind of stuff. And if you really just dissect what's being said in these rumors, you would realize Arya is not at Winterfell. Like, just based on the fact that, okay, there's this Arya that was sent from King's Landing that was then sent to the Boltons, and then the Boltons took her north. And that doesn't make a lot of sense, because they knew where Arya was during around the events of A Storm of Swords. It wouldn't make sense if then she was then sent from King's Landing. Like, that's what you'd have to say. The idea would have to be that Lady Stoneheart is willing to follow up on any lead, and so she just sends Harwin just in case, even though all the information would dictate that was not the case. So I could see the idea of Harwin. It would make a lot of sense. He would, be at Winterfell. He would have been there as, Theon, Rickon, Bran. They were growing up together. Maybe would have considered them kin. And so you can get to the indication that A, he would hate Theon for what he did. And 2, you can understand why maybe he would call Theon a kinslayer. So some of the things fit here, but it also leaves a lot of doors open. Like, how does Harwin get there? Because Moat Cailin is shut off. Did he maybe go through Howland Reed and go through that way, going through the neck? Because we know he didn't just, like, say, for instance, just get himself with the Bolton party that heads back up north. We know that's not the case, because if that was the case, he would have realized Theon was alive much earlier on and would have had news of Theon. It had to have been a thing where, like, he travels almost by himself, attaches himself to some party, and then enters Winterfell and finds all this stuff out. I think it's possible. I just don't know if there's enough to suggest that this person is Harwin. The next person that I've seen in the major theories is Hallis Mullen. This is who In Deep Geek believes is the person, and I think there's some interesting evidence, even though I don't come to the same conclusion. So Hallis Mullen is the man that is sent to really guard Catelyn. He is with her when she goes to, for instance, Storm's End and goes to see Renly and Stannis. She's the person that Catelyn sends with Ned's bones to go into the crypts at Winterfell. And so Hallis Mullen is a important figure, right? He has Ned Stark's bones, but we know that Moat Cailin gets closed to them, and so it wouldn't have been passable for Hallis Mullen. Catelyn even thinks about this later on, like, where did Ned Stark's bones end up? We also know from the character of Barbary Dustin, it appears that they have not made it north either. So it would indicate that Ned's bones probably ended up with Howland Reed, or maybe they just never got there. They were killed along the way, and now Ned's bones are just, scattered to the winds, which I don't know if George would necessarily do, but those are the kind of like the ideas that I would have. And then with the idea from Hallis Mullen is knowing that, what happens at Winterfell, the idea that the Greyjoys, then the Boltons take it, and this idea of fake Arya being married to Ramsay, and you also having the combination of a bunch of other people being there as well, with Mage Mormont, Galbert Glover, the news of possibly Jon being Rhaegar and Lyanna's, and also Robb's will. It could maybe lead to the idea that you send Hallis Mullen to go to Winterfell to maybe just sow some chaos in Winterfell and to possibly figure out what's going on with this Arya stuff. And then once Hallis Mullen gets there, he realizes all this isn't the case, that this Arya character isn't actually Arya. At that point, he just kind of starts acting on his own and doing his own stuff. But like we talked about, the Hooded Man likely hasn't actually killed anyone of note that we know of yet. So what has he really been doing? Why is there significance to this character that's been put there? It would also make sense from the point of view of Hallis Mullen would know of Theon. He would have known of the relationship between Theon, Rickon, and Bran, and maybe said, okay, well, you're a kinslayer. He would have hated Theon for everything that he did. That all kind of makes sense. But the other issue is, once again, would Hallis Mullen recognize Theon almost instantly? And it just kind of circles back to this idea for me, is that no matter what you look at for who possibly could be the Hooded Man, is the Hooded Man has to contradict themselves regardless of the way the theory goes. Because on one hand, they have to recognize Theon enough to where they're familiar with him, but they also at the same time not think that he was alive. And so at the same time, the way that Theon is so disfigured and looks so terrible, they somehow have to instantly know that that is Theon, when it's like, that just doesn't seem to be natural. And also, you think about it from the other way around. Theon has no recognition of who this Hooded Man is. So, how does Theon not recognize this person that he would probably know if they were at Winterfell, but the other person recognizes Theon, when Theon's appearance would be way more altered than the other person's? So there's a lot here to me that just doesn't feel right. There's like something fishy here. And so that leads to the last theory, is the theory I've always believed, and I think it has holes in it. I think every theory about the Hooded Man so far has holes. I don't think any of them fit perfectly. But the theory I believe in the most is that this is really just Theon seeing maybe a younger version of himself, albeit the appearance of the Hooded Man is not actually younger Theon, but it's like his personality. It's a version of himself. That's one of the biggest issues with the Theon theory, is that Theon doesn't recognize or seem to recognize his younger self. It isn't something that he thinks about later on. But when you think about the title of the chapter, and Theon himself constantly is thinking of his past deeds, the actions he's done, that there are ghosts here at Winterfell and they're angry with him. Think about A Clash of Kings after he actually kills the Miller's boys. We see Theon as he's completely paranoid. It seems like in all of his dreams he's haunted by nightmares. The castle of Winterfell itself seems to be wanting to throw out Theon. He doesn't go anywhere without guards anymore. His confidence is kind of worn down because of his actions. Theon, it feels like he's trapped, like it's Harrenhal at the end of A Clash of Kings. And so when you come back there for Theon, you kind of already have this building up of Theon seeing ghosts at Winterfell. He, for instance, sees Bran in the Weirwood. He's hearing his name. Maybe the old gods are communicating to him. The ghosts of Winterfell are talking to him. And when you have that part of it being there, that there already is this mysterious, ghostly feel to both the chapter and Theon's storyline at Winterfell. Plus, you build up the idea that Theon and his whole main arc of A Dance with Dragons is about identity. It's about the Reek Theon persona, and it's not necessarily about him going back to being Theon Greyjoy, because when he goes back to being Theon, it's not the Theon Greyjoy of his younger years. It's a much more matured and hopefully better version of Theon than he was when he was younger. And so this could be a possible confrontation with the younger version of himself, now mixed with Reek, and also mixed with the new Theon that he wants to be. And you even think about the wordage of certain things. So people that have a big argument with the Theon theory is, why would Theon, if this is a younger version of himself, or this is some split personality thing, why would Theon call himself a kinslayer? Theon, at the very beginning of A Dance with Dragons, even says he's not a kinslayer. And so this comes down to a tough point here, because you can interpret this many ways to try and fit the theory. One of them is Theon subconsciously realizes that the Miller's boys could actually be his own children, just based on the fact that he slept with the Miller's wife a few different times. There's not a lot of evidence to indicate that is the case, but it could fit the idea that maybe Theon subconsciously knows that to be the case, and that's why he calls himself a kinslayer. You could also look at the idea that his actions caused others to die. So, for instance, him taking Winterfell and him pretending that he kills Bran and Rickon directly leads to the death of Robb, someone he considered to be a brother, the one person of the Starks that he grew close to. Theon's actions directly got Robb killed because it leads to a whole trickle effect. Theon betrays Robb, didn't inform Robb what was going to happen in the north. He betrays him. He takes Winterfell. It makes Robb look weak. It makes it to where it's like he's the king who doesn't even have the north anymore. Also, his heirs are killed, so it makes him more vulnerable at that point. It leads Catelyn to release Jaime. It's a whole trickle effect. And so it could be this whole bigger thing that Theon is not saying that he's a kinslayer because of, Bran and Rickon, because he obviously knows he didn't kill Bran and Rickon, but his actions led to, well, Bran and Rickon haven't been seen since that point. Maybe they died. His actions could have led to Bran and Rickon possibly being dead in his own head, even if he wasn't the one that actually did it. So there's a lot of stuff here that you can use to fit the theory of why Theon, in a younger version of himself, would be telling his present self that he's a kinslayer, because it's maybe some of its insecurities. And you even think of the way it's so accusatory towards Theon. It doesn't feel like a normal conversation. Like, you don't go up to somebody and go, oh, Theon, and then titles, and then just accuse him of stuff and then walk away. Now, some people have also looked at the idea that Theon doesn't seem afraid by the Hooded Man, even though he believes this Hooded Man could be the person committing all these murders. He's not scared or anything. I don't think that necessarily has anything to do with this being just a ghost and Theon knowing this person won't kill him because they're not real. I think it has more to do with the fact that Theon is such a broken version of himself that he would rather die than, for instance, ever have to be tortured by Ramsay again. He's at a point where he doesn't want to live anymore. So, of course, he's not going to be afraid of somebody, killing him. And so I look at this ghostly version of Theon, and I think it fits perfectly with what happens at the end of this chapter. By the end of the chapter, Theon, doesn't want to die as Reek anymore. He's kind of transforming into Theon again. Now, we're not going to see that full transformation really until like his last chapter, but it starts that journey. It gets that whole conversation going that this could be Theon confronting, his younger self. And I think the biggest issues with this theory are obviously, one, Theon doesn't recognize himself as the hooded man. He gets a good look at him. There's no indication that he recognizes this person, regardless of who it is. The second problem is obviously the Kinslayer part, and that kind of has an issue with almost all of the theories. But it would make sense given the way that this hooded man seems very confident. And you even think about the way that A Clash of Kings introduces Theon, where he has like this hooded cloak and he has a dagger on him and stuff. Like, it kind of would be nice, parallels when we first get with Theon with his first chapter in A Clash of Kings. But it doesn't necessarily fit one for one. And so the biggest issue with the hooded man is that it doesn't fit any real theory perfectly. There's a possibility that every person I talked about in today's video could be the hooded man. There's a possibility that none of them could be. This hooded man maybe is possibly just nobody. It's just really, it's this hooded man showcasing the way the North feels about Theon. It could just be some random person, I think there's some issues with that, because why do they instantly recognize Theon? But that's a whole different thing. So let me know what you guys think about the hooded man theory. I know there's other people that some people just bring up, and even if you look on the wiki for the theories, there's other people that are listed, like Septon Shale, but there's just not anything there, and it's very unlikely. So I wanted to bring up the ones that at least made the most amount of sense to me, but I do personally believe it is Theon. I think this is one of the most clever theories in the community, and I think it's really awesome if that is the case. I could also see this as George himself doesn't know the answer to who the hooded man is. Sometimes George leaves the door open to certain things, and then maybe he fulfills them later on, and maybe we'll find something out that this was whoever. In the book, we just don't have any clarification on what happened to the character. Jon sends Alliser Thorne to go ranging and kind of be his eyes beyond the wall, and then we just don't see him. There are a couple of this party that are killed and are sent back more or less as a message to the wall, but not Alliser Thorne. So where is he? And I've really seen two trains of thought with the character of Alliser Thorne in A Song of Ice and Fire. Either one, he's going to be another character that at the wall that we just kind of forget about and George doesn't really bring back up. If you think about Benjen, it's been a number of books now since he's gone missing, and we still have really no evidence on anything that could have possibly happened to him. Can we make speculations? Of course. Did he die, or was he captured, or whatever? Like, you can make a lot of speculation, but it's based on very limited information. The same is kind of the case with Alliser Thorne as well. And so the two trains of thought I've heard is, one, he's dead, and he's more or less not really going to serve as a character anymore, but he might be part of the army of the dead, and could also serve as, similar to the way I talk about Stannis kind of being like a face to the others, like becoming this Night King figure, but maybe not the Night King of like the show where he has all these different powers and stuff, like just being a figurehead for that army. The same could apply if Alliser Thorne is part of the army of the dead. It could symbolize an antagonistic force for Jon, where Jon coming to the Night's Watch, like his biggest enemy throughout the early part of the series was Alliser Thorne, of course. And so that could then go to now he's with the dead. And you also think about their last exchange. It's kind of an interesting exchange if you're going out it from the route that Alliser Thorne dies and becomes part of the army of the dead. Alliser Thorne kind of gives a cryptic last message to Jon about, if he dies and all of this kind of stuff. It could mean in a lot of ways that Alliser Thorne and Jon will have one last confrontation, but this time Alliser Thorne is an other, and that could symbolize Jon's struggles. Whereas early in the series, Jon's struggle was not against the others, really. It was about fitting in, it was about what kind of person he was going to be. And now we're transitioning into the second half of the series where Jon is almost completely motivated by how do we stop the others, how do we band together, and how do we stop that threat? And so that would be really interesting is if George took the character of Alliser Thorne and put him into the army of the dead to kind of represent that the main antagonistic force for Jon is the others. So that's one proposed idea. I think it makes the most sense just given everything that's happening north of the wall. People are going missing, people are dying. You think about the way Tormund describes to Jon how, you don't see the others first, you feel them. The cold comes, and then people start just disappearing. And even when we see on like the Night's Watch march away from the Fist of the First Men, and how people that fall behind just go missing and die. Like north of the wall is getting more and more dangerous, and even the wildlings can't survive. And so Alliser Thorne dying north of the wall wouldn't be all that much of a shock or surprise. I do wonder if people would be a bit let down by that. And that's another thing that we have to consider with the book is how the show has influenced the way we look at a character like Alliser Thorne. I talked about this a lot in my book to show comparison, and one thing I talked about in the show was Alliser Thorne has a much bigger role because he takes on a lot of different characters' motivations against Jon, and he becomes the symbol of an antagonist to Jon's story. Whereas in the book, that's not the case. Alliser Thorne is a major antagonist for Jon in the first book specifically, and then once Jon and Alliser Thorne see each other again, which isn't until Storm of Swords and towards the end of the book, it's more like a split between Janos Slynt and Alliser Thorne. But again, Alliser Thorne isn't really like the big person that's the threat, because Alliser Thorne, he drops out relatively early in the Lord Commander choosing, and so Janos Slynt becomes kind of like the main antagonist, and Jon kills him in A Dance with Dragons, and then Alliser Thorne is just sent away. So that is kind of one idea of it, is that Alliser Thorne, not as major of a character in the book, and so we'll see him come back through the others. The second way of thinking, which I think is very fascinating, is could Alliser Thorne have a complete 180 in terms of his character arc? So, for a lot of people, Jon is believed to be a Targaryen, the son of Rhaegar and Lyanna. Some people do not believe that, so this theory wouldn't really be that valid. You could still come at it from a certain point of view or angle, but more or less, if you're looking at it from that point of view, Alliser Thorne was a Targaryen loyalist. And you think about the way A Dance with Dragons ended, the idea that Jon is killed by his brothers, that directly goes against their vows, killing another member of the Watch, and especially your Lord Commander. Alliser Thorne has been shown somebody that, yes, he is somebody that is an antagonistic force to Jon, but he does seem to be steadfast in his beliefs and for the Watch and all that kind of stuff. Could Alliser Thorne come back and almost shock all of us if he comes back to Castle Black and he denounces the people that actually did this to Jon, calling it cowardice, and they elected him to be Lord Commander? It was not their place to kill him. That goes directly against their vows. I've seen people bring this up, and I thought it'd be very interesting, because if that is the case, and we also have the fact that everybody finds out that he wasn't actually, this bastard of Ned, and that he was a Targaryen, and you think about Alliser Thorne, like, even if he doesn't believe Jon is a Targaryen, you might also have Jon pairing up with Daenerys at some point in the next 2 books if we get them. Could Alliser Thorne almost become like an uneasy ally to Jon? Even though their history has divided them, maybe now they see eye to eye. Maybe even the experiences that Alliser Thorne has, maybe he has an experience with the others where he barely survives in this ranging that Jon sent him on, and even though he might feel bitter towards Jon for costing a lot of men their lives north of the wall in this ranging and almost getting Alliser Thorne killed, he also does, see that threat more. Like, it's more of a personal threat. The others are more important now than his hatred towards Jon or any of that stuff. And so that's what I find to be very interesting. I personally think, though, given how timings of things are going to work out, and the way George has already done this a lot, where he introduces characters that might be important to the wall, or early on in the series seem like there's some significance with the character, and then they just kind of disappear. I do believe probably Alliser Thorne did die to the others, and the only way we'll see him again will be he'll be part of the Army of the Dead and be just a representation of the antagonistic force that Jon is trying to fight against. So that is where I think Alliser Thorne's going to go. I'd love to hear what you guys think. Do you think he's going to have more of an actual active role in the story going forward? Or do you think he is just a character that, because of the show, we've thought of him more as a main player or character in the northern plot line, when in reality he kind of isn't, and he never truly was? Because, you go back and you think, okay, Alliser Thorne is quite present in Jon's storyline for like the first half of Game of Thrones. Then he's not. He's kind of sent away. Book 2, he's not with Jon at all. He doesn't come back until book 3, during the last stretch of the battle for the wall, when him and Janos Slynt order him to try to assassinate Mance. And then, Dance comes along and Jon sends him away again. So he's not a character that's with the Wall and Jon plotline specifically all that much. But I'd love to hear you guys' thoughts. I always enjoy talking a little bit of Alliser Thorne. Really interesting character in both the book and the show. Now, Nettles is a Fire and Blood exclusive character, a character that takes part in the Dance of the Dragons and is one of the dragon seeds that ends up playing a big part in Rhaenyra's campaign. Now, I want to start off with, because this is not only going to be a video about the character of Nettles and what makes her so unique and an awesome character, but I also want to talk about why did House of the Dragon Ryan Condal decide to leave this character out of the show? And yes, the character is not in the show. The character of Nettles was mainly given to the character Rhaena in the TV show. So if you are not wanting spoilers for House of the Dragon or any of that, feel free to skip this video. This is going to have heavy spoilers, and I'm going to talk about some of the reasons as to why they decided to give the character to Rhaena, and also what the repercussions of that might be in the future, while we also go through the character. So let's already start off with some of the reasoning I believe House of the Dragon removed Nettles as a character. I think the real basic, simple answer to why the character of Nettles is not in the show is, I think in the House of the Dragon's team's views, Nettles is a character that they believed they could more or less give to another character. And I found this to be weird because of all of the dragon seeds, I think Nettles is like the one that stands out the most, that has the most personality, would be the hardest to one-for-one replace. And I just found that really to be interesting because if you think about Ulf, for instance, Ulf to me of the 4 dragon seeds is the most replaceable. He's barely a character in Fire and Blood. He's quite literally just described as he's a drunk. For instance, Hugh also is just, he's kind of like a brute. He's a kind of like a Robert Baratheon-esque figure in terms of like he's physically imposing, but he lacks basically any morals, so very different than Robert. Robert has his own complexities, but Hugh is much worse than Robert is. And so Hugh is somebody that is just a brute. That's really what he is. And then you have Adam, who Adam's a great character as well, but I think Nettles dwarfs all of them. And so when you have this idea that in the show, what we saw from season 2 is they more or less took this idea of, okay, well, Nettles and Sheepstealer, when they eventually go missing, it's actually in the Vale. It's in the Mountains of the Moon. She disappears there. And so they've kind of set up this idea where, okay, Rhaena finds Sheepstealer. I'm not even sure if that's what the dragon's name's going to be called in the actual series. But in terms of the idea is like, okay, well, this is where Sheepstealer is in the show. We can kind of morph the two together because Rhaena in Fire and Blood plays an extremely small role in the actual Dance of the Dragons. She is relevant like afterwards and like in the conclusion of it, but during it, basically a non-factor. She sits it out completely. So it makes sense given the point of view of like we have this character of Rhaena in the television show and we don't have anything for her to do. Let's just give her this role. And I understand that, but I think it is a massive missed opportunity. And one thing that I think is interesting is the Song of Ice and Fire community can never really agree on anything. That's just been our nature. We always argue on even very minor things. One thing everyone agrees on, even if your thoughts of House of the Dragon are completely different than mine, most people that have read Fire and Blood realize cutting Nettles out was a bad decision. It just doesn't make any sense. Nettles is a character, and let's kind of dive into her as a character a little bit here to kind of build some background. If you haven't read Fire and Blood and you don't know about her character, let me just give you some background so you understand what I mean by she's so unique and would have been awesome for the show. So Nettles is coming from the lower class. She's similar to, for instance, Davos, like Dunk. She is a very different point of view type of character than, say, the Targaryen ruling family or the Velaryons or any of that. She comes from lower class. She has no ties to Targaryen blood that we know of. There are rumors that she could possibly be Daemon's daughter. There's not a lot of evidence for this whatsoever, and I highly doubt it. I think it would actually contradict what George is going for with the character of Nettles. But this is Nettles' also description. She was small, skinny, brown-skinned, with black hair and brown eyes. She had crooked teeth and a scarred nose. According to Archmaester Gilladane, she could not be called pretty. Nettles was foul-mouthed, filthy, and fearless. Nettles is somebody that is like the polar opposite of the Targaryens and the Velaryons. And if you've only watched the show, the Velaryons in the books are more or less like discount Targaryens. They look very similar. They have the Valyrian features. They came from Valyria as well, so of course they're going to look like the Targaryens. Nettles is not like that at all. She is quite literally, if you could pick a character that is the most opposite of a Targaryen, it would be Nettles. And so that gets a lot of people to be kind of spiteful of Nettles, thinking she has some sort of powers or whatnot, because she's just, it seems like, this normal, lower class girl who's able to tame a dragon. And she's able to do it cleverly. And it also kind of disproves the idea that the Targaryens are the only ones that can claim dragons, because Nettles kind of disproves that. Now, there is a big asterisk on this, because Nettles tames a wild dragon. She doesn't tame, like, for instance, one of the Targaryen dragons. Those are brought up very differently than, say, the wild dragons. It's, for instance, kind of in a lot of ways why nobody is able to ever tame Cannibal, because Cannibal is just not a Targaryen dragon. There are rumors even it predates the Targaryen dynasty. It's not raised in captivity, more or less. It's kind of the idea, if you were to look at, say, a zoo lion versus a regular, like, in-nature lion. The two are going to have completely different, personalities. They're going to be different because one is brought up in captivity, one is not. One is brought up in nature. The same as the idea of, like, with, like, Sheepstealer, Cannibal, any of the wild dragons. And so Nettles stands out as this extremely different character. And I can also understand the idea of House of the Dragon. She wouldn't stand out as much. Like, she still would, because Nettles would be lower class. She would be brown-skinned, which is something we don't see in A Song of Ice and Fire a lot, which is another thing that makes her a really diverse and interesting character. You can make the idea that because of the Velaryon change and changing their appearance, she wouldn't stick out as much, but I still think she would, just given her description, if they did the character correctly, but who knows. And so you have this really clever character of Nettles who doesn't just rush in and try to tame a dragon. Like, for instance, we see Hugh stand up to Vermithor, and that's how Hugh gets Vermithor. Nettles is not like that. Nettles, what she does is every single morning, she takes a sheep and she gives it to Sheepstealer. She's more or less getting Sheepstealer familiar with people, and also getting Sheepstealer to recognize her scent. And it's the same idea of, like, if you've ever had a pet. I have a cat, and one of the big things with cats is routine. The way you build trust with your cat is, well, you feed them regularly and you play with them if they're younger especially. And so they start to get used to you. So, for instance, when my cat first moved into this house, she was very skittish. She wanted to hide a lot until she got to get more familiar with, us as a family and our scents, all that kind of stuff. And now she's, like, very clingy to me. She always wants to be around me. So that's the same idea with, like, Sheepstealer. It's just on a much more dangerous scale with Nettles. And so Nettles represents that uniqueness of a character. She represents a polar difference than everything we've seen with the Targaryen dynasty. And in a lot of ways, she also can almost undermine the Targaryen dynasty as well. The Targaryen dynasty, they're viewed as, like, half gods or higher beings than normal people because of their ability to have dragons. And so if you have a character like Nettles, who has no relation to the Targaryens that we know of, but she's able to tame a dragon, what does that say? It represents the idea that the people can control some of this power. The people can control dragons. It doesn't have to always do with Targaryen blood. And so that's a really important part of it. And so as we go through the characters of Nettles, she's a vital part of the dragonseed's part of the story. And this is the big, spoiler warning, because Nettles really becomes more of a character as we get into, like, season 3 of the show. As the dance really starts to kick off and we start seeing more dragons and more violence. Nettles is first part of the Battle of the Gullet. Now, the Battle of the Gullet is both a victory and a loss for the Blacks. In one part of it, they lose a good portion of the Velaryon fleet and their wealth. It is like the first big domino in the decline of House Velaryon. Jace, Rhaenyra's oldest son, is killed during this, and it's a huge part that's going to be different than in the show, whereas in the book, in Fire and Blood, Jace is at the moment, like after Lucerys' death, he is the person really in charge of Dragonstone and the war effort, where Daemon is not there. Like, Daemon's taking charge of the Riverlands. He is not just having visions and not doing anything. He's very much a vital part of the Targaryen war effort in terms of the black side of things. And so Jace, along with Corlys, are part of the other part of that, right? The Navy and the other effort of trying to take King's Landing. And Jace's death is pretty huge. He was well beloved by the people, and Nettles takes part in this battle. She sees the horrors, the warfare of what dragons can do, and there were a lot of dragons at the Battle of the Gullet. It was the turning point for the Blacks. And so Nettles stands as a big difference between the other dragon seeds, and especially Hugh and Ulf, not so much Adam. As Hugh and Ulf celebrate this as this great victory, Nettles is seen crying. We're told that she was deeply affected by the Battle of the Gullet. She's different than all these other people that are looking at war and are thirsting for it and thirsting for power and riches. Nettles is crying for, well, we're not exactly sure, but I think it's probably a mix of things. I think the carnage that she inflicted, the amount of people that she would have been responsible for killing, even though we know it's war, it's things like that are going to happen. It's probably that aspect, and also the death of Jacaerys, who was well loved. And so I think when you have a character of Nettles, you have the perfect character to represent the idea of, the whole thing of war being bad and what this dance of the dragons is really going to cause and the thousands of lives that are going to be taken because of the war. And having that perspective then go to Rhaena, who grew up in privilege and the upper class, her perspective cannot relate to Nettles at all because Nettles' background is also very clouded. We don't know how she really grew up. It's said that she was the daughter of a whore, more or less. We don't know if this is necessarily true, as we only have a little bit of testimony from people like Septon Eustace and Mushroom, who can be very unreliable at times. But the point of Nettles' story is that she grew up in poverty, and we're not even sure what her occupation was before she actually got Sheep Stealer in the dance. It's alleged that maybe she herself was having to sell her body to just get by, and some questions arise on how did she get these sheep to give Sheep Stealer. Was she stealing them? Was she maybe working for a sheep farmer, or what was she doing to get that? Either way, it's not necessarily important. It's just to show her background and how she's had to survive and struggle. It kind of reminds me a lot of Arya in King's Landing during the chapter where Ned is executed, her last of A Game of Thrones, where you see her struggling, having to steal, having to just try and get by. Kind of reminds me of Nettles in a lot of ways. And so as we then go forward, Rhaenyra has taken King's Landing. Nettles and Daemon are sent into the Riverlands to deal with Aemon. And it seems particular that Daemon specifically asks for Nettles. And a lot of questions are risen by this because the two form a very close relationship. Now, this is something that the show also is going to struggle with, and I wonder how they're going to change this. Is the rumors we're told in Fire and Blood are that either A, she was a paramour or a lover for Daemon. Daemon took a liking to her and the two were sleeping together, having some sort of relationship. Or two, it seems like Daemon just became like a father figure to her, and maybe he saw his own daughters in Nettles, or maybe he just felt bad for her, whatever the case may be. Or the third option is that Nettles was actually Daemon's maybe illegitimate daughter or something along those lines. Either way, the two form a very close relationship. We know that Daemon was gifting her with things, teaching her how to be more of a woman, how to bathe herself, and they were sleeping in adjoining bedrooms, more or less, and they were sharing baths together. And so this is where you get to a really interesting point of the story, because this is a foundational moment in the dance. When you have the betrayers in Ulf and Hugh at the Tumbleton, it turns Rhaenyra against all the other dragon seeds. So Adam is forced to flee, and that ends up in getting Corlys arrested. And then you have Nettles, who Rhaenyra wants to be killed because she believes that Nettles must be doing witchcraft or something to entice Daemon, and Mysareus feeding into, Rhaenyra's paranoia and kind of turning Daemon against Rhaenyra in a lot of ways, and you can see its manipulation. It's one of the reasons I don't believe Daemon and Nettles were sleeping together or anything like that. You gotta also remember Nettles is quite young, and I know in A Song of Ice and Fire, being 16 is still being a woman, which is crazy, but I just don't think that's the case. And I think what truly did happen is that Daemon viewed Nettles kind of like as a daughter figure. There's a lot of similarities between Baela and also Nettles. Like Bela is someone that also has a pretty, I don't know if I'd say big role in the dance, but she has a huge moment at the very end. And so she kind of reminds me of Nettles. The two are like fearless and they're dragon riders. They share a lot of similarities, albeit Bela comes from being the upper class and Nettles does not. So I think Daemon could also see some of those characteristics of himself in Nettles and tried to help her out. She was somebody that was fearless, that was helping them during this war effort, and was going to possibly die if Daemon and Nettles ever found Aemond and Vhagar. And so when you see this moment in which Rhaenyra orders Nettles' death, and of course that doesn't happen because the Maester brings this to the attention of Daemon. Well, it's a whole conspiracy, and I'm not going to get too far into it, but more or less, Manfred Mooten puts in place this whole plot that is really, it's thought about by the Maester. The Maester comes up with this whole conspiracy to just act like they didn't get the letter or the order from Rhaenyra and just tell Daemon so you don't upset Daemon or have to break a guest right. Daemon and Nettles then have to separate. Nettles goes into exile and Rhaenyra loses another dragon rider. Daemon will then go to Harrenhal, in which he'll never be seen again, and Nettles will be seen only one more time. It's said that she was seen at Crackclaw Point and then the Mountains of the Moon, and we'd only see her one more time, in which it would be recorded in 134 AC during the reign of King Aegon III Targaryen. Sir Robert Rowan would lead a royal army to the Vale of Arryn to support Sir Joffrey Arryn, as there had been reports of seeing Sheepstealer and wanting to finish this dragon off, more or less. And Aegon III, who is Rhaenyra's son, her first son by Daemon, he was a huge I don't like dragons, and you can't blame him, seeing what dragons kind of did to his family. His mother was killed by a dragon in front of him. He was very anti-dragons, and it's one of the reasons that the dragons kind of die out. But more or less, this doesn't go well. A lot of these men end up dying, and Nettles and her dragon were last seen flying further into the Mountains of the Moon. This would end our recorded history of Nettles and Sheepstealer, but there would be rumors, more or less, and to this day, the Vale mountain clans tell stories about a fire witch who once lived in a hidden valley within the mountains. This is very much likely Nettles. It has to be, given the location of where the character was, the timing of when these stories were happening, and it seems that an offshoot clan of the Painted Dogs actually ended up worshipping her. So kind of what we see like in Alice Rivers, how she has her whole little thing at Harrenhal, kind of the same idea applies here with Nettles, and we understand this perfectly because dragons are seen as a big source of power, that you are above other normal people. And so this clan would send their boys to prove their courage by bringing her gifts, and were only considered men after they had faced the flames of her dragon and returned with burns. This seemed to then originate into the idea of what the burned men do, where youths must give some part of their body to the fire to prove they have the courage to be a man. And that's all we know about Nettles. So Nettles, for the most part, kind of disappears into history after the dance. But think about everything I talked about in today's video and how just cool, awesome Nettles could have been in the show. And going back to Daemon and Nettles, the thing that doesn't make sense in the show now is the one thing that turns Rhaenyra against Daemon is the dragonseeds. And the thing that really turns them against each other is because it's reported that Nettles and Daemon had a relationship and they were sleeping together. Well, if Rhaena is going to take up the part of Nettles, Rhaena is Daemon's daughter. There's no idea that there would be oh, Daemon is sleeping with his daughter. No, that's just not going to happen. And if that is what they're going to do, that is dumb. So there has to be something else that changes the way Rhaenyra just goes against Daemon. And I guess the idea could more or less be that now that Rhaena has a dragon, that maybe Daemon is going to try and take the throne for himself, kind of similar to what he was doing in season 2, and that maybe turns Rhaenyra against him. It just feels like we'd be recycling the same material, though, and that's one thing that really bothers me about the depiction of Daemon in the book versus the show is Daemon in the book doesn't seem to have these issues of, oh, I'm trying to be king myself but not backing Rhaenyra. And Daemon in the book is much more of a competent military commander, and he's able to actually rally the Riverlands, whereas in the show, Daemon really doesn't do anything. He gets the Blackwoods to commit war crimes on the Brackens, and then that kind of comes to bite him in the butt later. When you have Lord Tully then come to Harrenhal and getting the Riverlands to then back Daemon, it doesn't have anything to do with Daemon doing anything himself, right? Like, he's just kind of given the Riverlands. Like, it has nothing to do with Daemon. So that's a whole different thing. And I have a lot of House of the Dragon, like, just kind of discussion videos I want to talk about as we get, closer to House of the Dragon season 3 and that content. More people might be more interested in it. I had originally planned this to be an Aemond video, but I thought, given the fact that Nettles, a character that's not known in the show, let's talk about her first, and then as we get closer and more excitement comes out about House of the Dragon, we'll talk about Aemond. But let me know what you guys think about Nettles. I think a massive missed opportunity of House of the Dragon. I think most people in the community believe this. It was one of the biggest, I think, argument points about the show, especially when we were in season 2 and we weren't sure if we were getting Daeron either. Daeron and Nettles being two of the best characters of the dance. If they both had been out, would have been crazy. But yeah, I think a huge missed opportunity. And this is the kind of stuff I think that George has become frustrated with House of the Dragon with, because, having Nettles be completely removed from the show completely changes the story of the dance. And even when you think about Maelor, that was a really big sticking point as well in his arguments. I just got done reading the dance section of Fire and Blood for my Maester conspiracy theory and putting everything together. And Maelor not being there is a huge part of the story, especially for, Rhaenyra's downfall. It's really like the first big domino. I have a lot of questions going into House of the Dragon, and there's reasons that I am not the most excited for it. I don't plan to cover it as much as I will Knight of the Seven Kingdoms, but we'll see. Thank you guys all for watching. I hope you guys enjoyed, and let me know, what do you love about Nettles? Bye, guys.